I'd like to welcome everybody to our today's webinar, How to Discuss Your Options, including clinical trials with your care team. We hope this webinar gives patients the inspiration and knowledge they need to discuss treatment options with their healthcare providers, resulting in a plan that ensures the patient's best health and quality of life. Our thanks to Vectiv Bio for generously sponsoring this webinar, and to our speakers for offering up their time and expertise. I am Lisa Metzger, Oley Foundation's Director of Community Engagement and editor of our bi-monthly newsletter. I will be moderating today's webinar. I'd like to offer a few words about the Oley Foundation for those of you who may be unfamiliar with us. The foundation was founded in 1983 by Dr. Lynn Howard and her patient Clarence Oley Oldenburg, hence the name, to enrich the lives of people on home parenteral or IV nutrition, also called HPN or TPN, and enteral nutrition or tube feeding. We do this through education and programs such as this one, as well as outreach and networking. Today, Oley serves over 26,000 members with a variety of programs, all of which are free of charge for patients and their families. You can learn more about us at oley.org. So before we begin the webinar today, I'd like to quickly review a few Zoom details. So on the toolbar at the bottom, or maybe the top of your screen, there are a few useful options. You can click on the live transcription button to turn closed captioning on or off. Please note that the captions are auto-generated and can be very inaccurate. Please use the chat function if you have questions for the Oley staff, which would be me or Rosalind Dahl, who's also on the line. Send the message to hosts, please. If you have questions for the speaker, please use the Q&A function. We will answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A period following Dr. Venick's presentation, which would be about a little after 1:45. Oh, sorry. This webinar is being recorded and a link to the recording will be posted on the Oley website. This is the agenda for today's webinar. We'll do our best to stick to these times. We've posted the agenda on our website in case you want to refer back to it. See oley.org/enrichment programs. On the same page, you can find bios for all of our speakers. Please visit the website to learn more about each of our speakers, as in the interest of time, I will be brief in introducing them today. Note that I will be introducing them in reverse order. So I'll start with Dr. Venick. Dr. Venick serves as Director of the Intestinal Rehabilitation and Transplantation Services at UCLA, where he has been on faculty for over 15 years. Dr. Venick has done extensive research on intestinal failure-associated liver disease, autoimmune hepatitis, and medication adherence. He has served as site investigator in several clinical trials for patients with intestinal failure and short bowel syndrome. Audrea, who will be our second speaker today, is a former home IV or parenteral nutrition consumer. Audrea lost 95% of her small intestine in 2010 during a D&C procedure following a miscarriage. Audrea is joining us today from the Dominican Republic, where she and her family have been living since February. Audrea and her family have embraced island life, are diligently studying Spanish, and are actively engaging their church and community in planning future mission outreach programs. Audrea will share more about both of these in her presentation. And our first speaker, Michelle Barford, was a registered nurse for 32 years before she retired in 2009 after having had surgery that resulted in short bowel syndrome. Michelle says the surgery saved her life, but it also changed her life dramatically. Michelle is an Oley Ambassador volunteer and is currently on home IV or parenteral nutrition. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you. I've been asked to speak today about what is an advocate and how do you advocate. So I thought we'd start with the definition. The definition of an advocate is, and there you go, Roz, you can bring up that first slide. As a noun, it's one who defends or maintains a cause or proposal, one who supports or promotes the interest of a cause or a group. It's useful for a consumer advocate as one who pleads the cause of another. As a verb, It's to support or argue for. And that can be used as a group that advocates or a tradition for advocating for. So why do you become an advocate? Usually it's because something has happened to you or a friend or family member. You feel compelled to do something, to make something better, or to make someone aware. Advocating becomes the one thing that you can do that makes a difference. So how do you advocate? There are many ways to be an advocate or to advocate. Individually, you can write letters, make phone calls, or join groups. However, when you go to see a doctor, it's best to bring a list of your concerns or needs. This helps you to organize your thoughts and keep you focused on the problems that you need to be addressed. You can also and should take notes from the answer that you receive. But when do you need to bring someone with you to take notes or write down what the doctors say? Sometimes it's too overwhelming to be the one who asks the questions and also has to be the one who writes the answers. You get concerned that you're wasting the time of the person you're discussing a situation with. That can lead you to rush and get incomplete information or not be able to get what you want or need. So you go from being an advocate to asking someone to go with you and to advocate for you. As someone who has had to advocate for my special needs son, I was the mama bear, the one who, when I walked into the meeting, I had the State Guide to Special Education Services manual in my hand and laid it on the table for all to see. And that told them that I knew what the law states. So don't try to persuade me to do something that wouldn't be in the best interest of my child. But when I got sick and needed answers or wanted to know where I should go for help, it was much different. Suddenly, I was the one who needed an advocate. When you become the one who needs assistance, it changes the whole dynamic of relationships. Fortunately, I had a fabulous team. My oncologist sought out other facilities and treatment options. I was the first patient he had with carcinoid cancer of the small intestine. No matter how much sicker I got, he continued to work on my behalf. Not everyone has that, but one physician, a surgeon, felt he couldn't do what I wanted and what I thought would fix my major problem. I couldn't make appointments any longer, as he said there was nothing more that he could or would do. So I wrote him a letter, a very passionate letter. I told him that just waiting around for the next episode of sepsis and putting my family through another near-death event was unacceptable to me. At the end, I stated that I would rather die trying than die a slow, painful death, a choice that I was not willing to put myself through, nor my family. And I would not hold him responsible if things went sideways. That his agreeing to at least try would absolve him. When I got my next bout of sepsis, he came to see me and said he would agree to do the surgery, and he left. He never said a word about the letter. The outcome was exactly what we had hoped it would be. He found the fistula that was causing the continued episodes of sepsis, and he repaired another issue he found at the back of my abdominal cavity that, if left untended, would cause my eventual demise. He came into my room later like a peacock showing off his feathers. He was so proud of himself. But when I went to my post-op appointment, he then told me how powerful my letter had been and that he had never had a patient quite like me. To this day, I've reached out to him and to my GI doctor in Memphis when I need a second opinion or an explanation of what my physicians here are thinking. They are a sounding board for me. One has retired now, but the other one is still working part-time and told me recently that he will retire in a couple of years, but he gave me his cell number so I can call him whenever I need to. Good relationships need to be cultivated and maintained whenever you can. But what do you do when an advocate you need wants to continue beyond when you need them? That becomes very tricky. The worst time for me was when I had a friend who kept telling everything about me to everyone. Even when I asked her to please stop, she continued. She said it was because they would ask her how I was doing, and she always felt to give them every little detail of me and my issues. I finally had to let her go. Something she never quite understood. After everything I've done for you was her mantra. That's when I knew that it was no longer about me, but for her own need to feel important or needed or wanted, whatever. It was hard and very painful because my husband did business with her husband. It was such a sticky wicket, as my mother would have said. But that situation did not stop me from asking for help in other areas or being the one who assisted others in the same times of need. It just made me more aware of how to help people and know when to step back and let them blossom and be in the center. In essence, I became the vase and they were the flowers. Now that you've advocated for yourself or a family member, you need to develop a care plan. The first step is to write down all of your information in a format that's easy to understand. An example is your medical conditions, your current medications, your insurance information, advanced care planning information, and your emergency contacts. Once this is done, you need to review these on a regular basis or when something changes, such as your medications or diagnoses. Take this with you to your doctor's appointments. They should review them at every visit, depending on how often you're scheduled to be seen. Nowadays, they will have this readily available through computers, which make them easy to access between specialties. Next, you need to think about who you want to be a part of your team, such as a family member or some friends. If your spouse is able, that's the logical first choice. But if he or she is employed or otherwise unable to go to appointments with you, therefore you want to ask somebody else to go with you, another family member or a friend as a backup. This choice needs to be thought about and considered with very great care. I had such a friend who came with me or stayed with Mark, my husband, while I had procedures or surgeries. But as I stated above, she needed the self-importance of only being needed. But as the relationship changed, it became toxic to the extent that we had to part ways. Another way to become your own advocate is to join groups like the Oley Foundation. There you can meet people best suited to understanding and be knowledgeable about your diagnosis. But there are other groups too. And Roz, if you could pull up the next slide. So there's ASPEN, the American Society of Enteral and Parenteral Nutrition. ASPEN is dedicated to improving patient care by advocating science and practice of clinical nutrition and metabolism. Founded in 1976, ASPEN is an interdisciplinary organization whose members are involved in the provision of clinical nutrition therapies, including parenteral and enteral nutrition. With more than 6,000 members from around the world, ASPEN is a community of dietitians, nurses, pharmacists, physicians, scientists, students, and other health professionals from every facet of nutrition support, clinical practice, research, and education. Next slide, please. NORD is the National Organization of Rare Diseases. NORD is a patient advocacy organization dedicated to individuals with rare diseases and the organizations that serve them. NORD, along with its more than 300 patient organization members, is committed to the identification, treatment, and cure of rare disorders through programs of education, advocacy, research, and patient services. The DDNC is the Digestive Disease National Coalition. The DDNC is your advocacy organization in our nation's capital. In conjunction with our member organizations, DDNC seeks to raise awareness of these diseases in Congress and in the media. And every February, just as an aside, you can agree to go to Washington. You sign up to go with a group of people that the DDNC puts together. And then from the hotel to the Capitol, which is about a half a mile walk, You then proceed to go and meet the representatives and the senators to make them aware of what your situation is or the groups that you are advocating for. I've gone several times, and though I've only met my representatives maybe once, you do meet with their aides, and it is very, very beneficial. But each of these groups serves a different need, but all of them are excellent and worth getting involved with. They can give you the resources you need to be an advocate for you. They have worldwide networks that you can bring to your local physicians to get the help that you want or need. Once you have your care team, once you have your care plan intact and you have persevered and a few months or years have passed, all of this will become second nature. You will think of these things without having to refer to a list. However, some of us are better suited to making lists, not me, and having them assist us in organizing our thoughts and making our plans for what we need to do each day, week, or month. Yes, all of your new problems will seem overwhelming, and that you will have questions, lots of questions, but having an advocate assist you, as well as developing a care plan, it will all help and seem less frightening, and it will feel more manageable to you. But never forget, you are in charge of you. You are your best advocate, the one who can seek out alternatives and bring those to the table. If your care team members don't agree, then seek out new care team members, or, in order to get your answers, but be direct. You can't afford to waste time beating around the bush. But if that's not the way you function, then ask a team member to do that for you. Know when to ask someone to be your advocate, to hold your hand and be there for you when you get the hard answers to your questions. I recently had a procedure done that has left me with stabbing pain and continued bruising. I reached out to my surgeon and insisted this be investigated, and an ultrasound was ordered. The tech performing the ultrasound was concerned enough that she called the radiologist during the procedure to discuss what she was seeing. Of course, she didn't tell me what was going on, but the results didn't seem to explain what I was experiencing, so I left yet another message for the doctor. But a non-medical person called to relay what the doctor wanted me to know. But I kept asking questions she couldn't answer, until finally I said, what a shame the doctor didn't call me himself so he could explain this in a way for me to understand. Just today, I got a call to see if I could see the doctor in the afternoon. And I said, hell yes. Well, not exactly, but you get the drift. He actually concurred that I do have a problem that needs to be monitored, and it may also require additional surgery to repair. I trusted my gut that something was wrong, and then I kept after the ones responsible until they listened to me. It's time consuming and often frustrating, but no one will care about me as much as me, and the same is true with you. Most healthcare agencies have methods of communication through systems such as My Chart or My Health. Use these tools and use them often. If you don't get the answer you want, find out why. If you still don't agree, then find someone else. This will take time, and know that in the end, you may never get the answer you're seeking. But you and you alone will know when it's time to move on. And now you'll be hearing from Audrea Medina.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm coming to you from sunny Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. And I was going to speak to you in Spanish, but my Spanish is very poquito right now. And even though I dream in verb conjugations, I didn't think you'd want to hear any of that. So originally, as Lisa said, I lost my intestine about 13 years ago now. And I guess you could say that I'm pretty much an expert on me. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about, kind of my story, a little bit of my story, and how we decided to do a clinical trial. We were living, and we're from Dallas, Texas, and though Dallas is known for doing everything bigger and better, there's not a great short bowel syndrome place there. And I didn't have a team of experts there. And kind of to piggyback a little bit on what Michelle was just sharing, basically I was piecemealing my healthcare together, a doctor from here, a doctor from there, a doctor from there, and they were all in different hospital systems. And that really created a lot of stress for me because they weren't talking together and there was no team and nobody working for me. I carried the burden of responsibility, and I was heavy laden with that. And I was trying to manage what I really didn't understand, and I was certainly no expert at, and it was very overwhelming. Meanwhile, during this time, my family and I would go up north to Omaha once a year to speak to a team of experts there. There was an intestinal rehabilitation program that we got connected with, and they were able to give me answers about questions and things that every time I left, I felt, oh, that's so helpful. Now I can do this next year. And basically we decided just a few years ago, about 4 years ago, we decided to up and move up there because I came out of one of those meetings crying and telling my husband, if these were my doctors all the time, my health would be much different. And my husband gave up his job. We gave up our family. All of our family was from there. We pulled our children out of school, and we just upped and moved within 3 months to Nebraska. Going from Dallas to Nebraska in February in the middle of a storm, a big snowstorm. I'm happy to be in the Caribbean right now. Let's just say that much. But once settled there, at any given appointment, I had between 3 and 6, maybe even more people in the room with me, answering questions, using their combined knowledge to advocate and to come up with a treatment plan for me that worked. And they were all within the same system. And this greatly relieved the burden of responsibility that I had on my own. And it freed me up to be Audrea again, wife, mother, a patient, but not somebody who was worried about scheduling, researching, managing, or any of those things. I didn't have to worry about that anymore. I could just simply be a version of the former Audrea before I lost my small intestine. And my health did begin to improve under this care, and it got stable. And so I had good days and I had bad days. There's ebbs and flows, and many of you recognize and do, have the same thing that occurs. But I had 6 good months in a row, which was amazing. I had no hospitalizations. I had loads of energy, and I was able to maintain a part-time job, which was just crazy because that hadn't happened before for any length of time. Now, during one of my regular visits with my doctor and his team, he had broached the subject of a new clinical trial drug coming out. And I just wondered out loud, well, I wonder if I would be considered a good candidate for that. And at that point, I had my 6 good months. And so we kind of discussed it a little bit. And we decided maybe I could be. I had originally tried another drug several years before. And because my health wasn't stable, the drug didn't work. Not because it was a bad drug, but because I wasn't in a good place to receive the most benefit from it. And so this new drug was supposed to do similar things to the old drug. And it was supposed to help me come off TPN for good. And I think at that point I was on 4 or 5 days a week. I'd come off a couple times, had to go back on, and it fluctuated with my weight, hospital stays and all that. And similar to probably what many of you have had to do. So one of the things that I most appreciate about my doctor and his team is how they so thoroughly explained everything. They went through what the drug was, how it was supposed to work in my body, what the outcome results were, what we were looking for, what adverse symptoms could be. And they made sure I understood everything before I even moved forward to think about becoming part of the trial. And so initially, as my husband and I discussed the possibility of me joining, one of the biggest and most major concerns I would say that we have was, the first thing was this going to work? Because we knew that in a clinical trial, at least this particular one, within the first year, it's randomized. So I might get, it was twice a week. So I might get drug twice a week. I might get placebo twice a week. I might get drug once a week or placebo once a week. And was it going to work? So that was our, one of our first questions. Now, within the second, I will just say this, within the second part of the trial, I was going to get drug, everybody would, but was it worth it to do that for a year? So the second part was, if I did receive the drug, would I have adverse symptoms? I tend to be very sensitive to things. And so I tend to have reactions. So that was a question. Would I derive any benefit whatsoever? But I had gotten to a place where I was pretty much satisfied I could maintain my health the way I was. So if nothing happened, okay. And that leads me to, we finally decided, well, why not? The potential of freeing myself from the tether of being connected to TPN on a daily basis, that was, highly encouraging and motivating. And it was worth, it was worth trying at least. And with this new trial, the drug, because I was stable, if there had been any adverse reactions, I knew I could just stop it at any time. And my team was going to be very good, and they were very good about contacting me and keeping close eye on me during all of this. And so ultimately I decided I didn't mind being a lab rat, because, the potential of what it could help versus where I was, it was worth it for us. And so, and if this didn't work, then one day something else would come up. And I have a brother who's a surgeon. And when I was really discouraged years and years back, he said, Audrea, one day, because we live in such an advanced technological society, one day somebody's going to come up with a drug or a surgery or a procedure or something that is going to help you where you are. And I just remembered that and thought, okay, well, maybe this is it. And so, but I would say the hardest part about being in the clinical trial was basically I'm doing a science project on myself. And I was an English and communications major, as you can tell by the fact that I enjoy telling stories. And I didn't really like science. And I only got through by force of determination and hard work. So basically, as I'm doing this science project on myself, I have to keep up with all the different variables, and they all had to be the same. If you remember your science projects, on the same day, I had to set a drinking schedule and keep to it no matter how thirsty I was. And there was no cheating, and I didn't cheat because I don't believe in cheating. I had to log every drink. I had to measure every output. I had to track every stool. Thankfully, I didn't have to measure that, because that might have been the end of it for me. And I had to track it all in a device, like a little phone. And this was tedious because I'm a wife, I'm a mother, I have three children, and I was homeschooling and I was working. Anyway, all of that, it was tedious, but I would just remind myself, because the trial that I did, I was the very first person in all of the United States and North America to try it. And I kept thinking, what I do needs to be accurate, because this is not just helping me and my family and my health and myself, but this is setting the stage for other people who are coming behind me. And the information that they need needs to be accurate, and I need to just push through it and persevere. And if I would forget to do something, my nurses were great about texting me, hey, Audrea, did you forget this? Did you forget this? And then I would do. They made things as easy for me as possible. So I'm really, really thankful for the team that I have. And then I began to see changes in results, and my TPN was decreasing and my output was increasing. And then it became interesting. Oh, now I'm seeing things happening. And I knew I was getting drugged, because on one day of the week, I would have a reaction, a skin reaction. So we knew I was getting something. And that was kind of exciting. So giving myself permission to try this new drug, it improved my life to such a degree, because now I've been doing this for 3 years, but it improved my life to such a degree that my family was able to move to another country to do meaningful mission work. And this was a dream that we thought had been crushed when I lost my intestine. And so the last thing I want to leave you with is this. If your doctor's merely reactive, like I had wonderful doctors in Dallas, but they were reactive. They weren't proactive. They weren't forward thinking like the doctors that I have. So if your doctor is like that, find a new doctor. United States is full of incredible doctors and teams who want to come together to actively work to give you the best benefit and the best treatment plans for you to live a life doing whatever it is that you want to do and you are called to do, kind of like with me. And you're not stuck in your situation unless you choose to remain stuck in it. If you have a good doctor and a good relationship with your doctor, just ask them, are there any clinical trials that you think would help me? Do you know about any? And if there's nothing, just wait and be patient and wait with expectation, because something is coming. Your health is worth it. The US, as I said, is filled with admirable experts, and they want to help you find a solution. And ultimately, if you're feeling sad, if you're feeling discouraged, because I've been there, friends, if you're worried, if you're concerned, and you're just plain weary of doing what you're doing, I want you to remember that your life has value, you have purpose, and you have meaning simply because you are God's beautiful creation and you are perfectly designed. My life's motto has become, I can do hard things. And I want to give that to you today. You can do hard things, and help is on the way. And maybe it's a clinical trial, or maybe it's something else, but something is going to come up that's going to help you one day. And I want you to hold on to hope and not forget, because I've been doing this for 13 years and I never thought I would be where I am today. And now I'm going to turn you over to one of those wonderful experts, Dr. Venick.
Audrea, thank you so much. And thank both you and Michelle for wonderful talks and truly inspirational. And I greatly enjoyed hearing both of your stories and with some wonderful lessons. I hope to be able to continue to some extent in the same usefulness as what we've heard over these next 15 minutes or so. The goals of my talk will be also focused on the clinical trial aspect of care for patients with intestinal failure and intestinal rehab patients. I do have just a couple of disclosures listed here, which is essentially I've participated as a site investigator in trials in this area, as Lisa had mentioned, sponsored by Takeda, Vectiv Bio, and Proterra. Again, the goals of our next 15 minutes or so are really to just define some of the terms so that we're all on the same page with regards to adaptation, intestinal failure, and rehab. Emphasize, I think, two things that both Michelle and Audrea pointed out: the importance of a multidisciplinary approach for patients with intestinal failure, as well as the importance of an individualized plan of care. And then again, to really spend some time on clinical trials, defining them, and hopefully pointing out or sharing some useful information for those on our webinar today. So intestinal failure, I would define as a critical reduction in the absorptive capacity of the small intestine, so that the ability to maintain adequate nutrition, fluid, and electrolyte absorption is impaired or impacted. Clinically, in trials, many of us will define intestinal failure as the need to be on parenteral nutrition for 60 to 90 days at a minimum, and of course for many much longer or lifelong. Just to give a little bit of a sense of causes of intestinal failure in children, this is from the Pediatric Intestinal Failure Consortium. I care for both children and adults. And what we can appreciate here is about 2/3 of the causes of intestinal failure in kids are accounted for by short bowel syndrome, and specifically by causes that are either congenital or oftentimes in the early newborn period. Those include necrotizing enterocolitis, gastroschisis, intestinal atresia, and volvulus. And then the other third tends to be made up of motility disorders, as well as congenital disorders causing diarrhea and high stool output. In adults, while we still have around 2/3 of the cases accounted for by short bowel syndrome, the specific causes are quite different. As you can see, and this is from roughly 2,000 adults in the intestinal transplant registry, a large proportion of adults with intestinal failure are a result of vascular complications causing ischemia to the small bowel, complicated IBD, refractory to medical management, trauma, as well as tumors or cancers. Desmoid tumors would be a prototype, but as Michelle had shared, a whole host of other intra-abdominal processes can lead to or be associated with short bowel syndrome and intestinal failure. The goal of intestinal rehab teams is to walk patients through, all at different paces, this process of intestinal adaptation. This is a process we know that starts after resection of the small bowel. And essentially the goals are to transition from dependence on parenteral nutrition to complete enteral autonomy or complete dependence on enteral calories. This is something that can continue for months or years. Oftentimes in the pediatric population, you see the peak sort of intestinal adaptation around 24 to 36 months after resection. But this is very variable for all patients, and with new drug development can change for the better, hopefully, over time. This is beyond the scope of our talk, but just to sort of share that there's a lot that's preclinical and that's known sort of in animal models and in translational science with regards to the mechanisms that occur during this process of adaptation that helps sort of overcome the loss of intestinal surface area. And those are shown in the graphic here. Again, because of the heterogeneity of all intestinal rehab patients, we really need to individualize and think broadly about the tools in our toolbox. And some of those are shown here. Those include changes or optimization in parenteral nutrition support. And in 2022, that certainly includes selecting the right type of lipid, which has been a hot area for the past decade. It also includes optimizing diets for patients with short bowel syndrome and the active involvement of registered dietitians in one's care. For some patients, this may also include supplemental formula or for younger patients, gastrostomy or jejunostomy tube feeds when appropriate. And we get to medications, a whole host of medications that can help with motility or dysmotility, medications that can help with complications such as bacterial overgrowth, and then medications that can help optimize absorption, such as glutamine, growth hormone, or the GLP analogs. For certain patients, non-transplant surgeries may have a role, whether that's with managing fistulae, adhesions, complications or challenges with ostomies, or consideration for bowel tapering or bowel lengthening surgeries. And then finally, intestinal transplantation. Well, there are very specific indications, and the majority of intestinal rehab patients won't meet such indications. Transplantation is something that can be considered as well, certainly for the right patient. The goals of rehab teams, I think, are simply stated here, obviously to enhance the absorption of enteral calories, reduce parenteral nutrition calories, and minimize complications that can be seen on TPN, including central line associated bloodstream infections, intestinal failure associated liver disease, and vascular thromboses of central venous catheters. And perhaps most importantly, to improve one's disease management and quality of life. The concept of an intestinal rehab team, I think, is paramount. And I recognize, depending on where one lives in the country, as Audrea had eloquently pointed out, this can be challenging and it can be sometimes somewhat fractured. But ideally, an intestinal rehab team should be patient-oriented, as we see the patient sort of in the middle of care in the graphic, and should have many disciplines involved in the care and the thinking and the approach of the patient. Those include nursing, those include gastroenterology, nutrition, surgery for some patients, social work, and a whole host of others, stomal therapy nurses for some patients, mental health experts, pharmacists. One could also certainly include patient advocates, as we're hearing from today, as a broader circle in today's world for how one can receive care. No doubt, this has been shown to help improve outcomes. This is just over time in the medical literature, and this multidisciplinary approach has really led to significant improvements over, by medical terms, a relatively short period of time, such that long-term survival in the modern era for patients with intestinal failure is approaching 95% at many of the multidisciplinary centers. So with that, we're going to now pivot and talk a little bit about clinical trials, because that certainly for some of us may be of interest. So what is a clinical trial? Well, these are research studies for our purpose performed in people that are often aimed at evaluating interventions or medications. In the arena of intestinal rehab, they're often aimed at finding out if a new treatment is safe and efficacious relative to current or standard of care treatments. They may test ways to detect the disease early before one may have symptoms, whereas other trials may be focused on preventing health-related problems. And yet others can really look at how to make one's life better when faced with chronic diseases or chronic health problems. As many of us know, there are different phases of clinical trials, and trials advance through essentially 4 phases when testing a new treatment or drug. Those can be aimed at finding the right dosage of a medication, as well as its efficacy, and looking at potential side effects. New medicines are often tested first in preclinical settings in animals or in basic science or translational settings. And if those results are favorable, the Food and Drug Administration may then authorize a study to be conducted in humans. If after passing through the first 3 phases of study and an intervention is safe and effective, and our FDA approves it for clinical use, there can then be ongoing studies, oftentimes a phase 4 trial, to continue to monitor its effectiveness and long-term data with regards to any potential side effects. So why would one consider a clinical trial? And I think we heard reasons about this earlier in our discussion today. Well, perhaps because prior treatments weren't working well. Perhaps because participants may want to find out about new treatments on the horizon before they're widely available. Some patients whom I've had the privilege of working with talk about wanting to be proactive, as Audrea said, play a little bit more active role in one's healthcare. There's certainly an element, I think, of altruism and for any clinical trial participant, where one may want to help sort of the field in general, and to learn about health challenges for themselves, for their family, for future generations as well. So where can we find information about trials? Well, starting with asking your healthcare providers, and certainly I realize that may be very variable in terms of those who have experts in the field caring for them versus perhaps patients in less or more underserved areas, but starting with healthcare providers. But there's also a number of valuable resources online. I just wanted to share some of those. Michelle had pointed out some great patient advocacy and other professional groups within our field. The NIH and the US National Library of Medicine actually have a very user-friendly website, clinicaltrials.gov, and they have sort of a revamped beta site that is easy to navigate. It includes, I think, 400,000 research studies. And if one just sort of focuses on intestinal failure, you can find a lot of current, up-to-date studies with contact information and where they are in their enrollment or so forth. So I would certainly encourage this site as a starting point. As we again heard from Michelle, certainly our sponsors today, the Oley Foundation, I think has an excellent website. There is a search engine here where some of the research studies in the field of intestinal rehab are highlighted. Aspen is another wonderful source, same thing. One can type in clinical trials and find up-to-date information on many of the North American trials. And then the last a group that I've highlighted, the Intestinal Rehab and Transplant Association, and their website is in the process of being revamped to some extent, but has information on certain centers and other resources from an educational standpoint that one might find useful. And again, a whole host of others. These are just some of the organizations I wanted to highlight. I certainly agree with Michelle, NOR, DDNC, and a number of other organizations that could be helpful. Also, social media and patient chat groups. We find a lot of patients come to us because of another patient that was in a trial, and certainly that's a big part of all of our lives in 2022. So in a clinical trial, what are like the steps? Well, oftentimes contacting the clinical trial study coordinator. I'm privileged to work with a phenomenal study coordinator, and their information is often listed like in clinicaltrials.gov and so forth, how to get a hold of a clinical trial team. One can then set up a screening appointment where the trial team would look at inclusion and exclusion criteria, get to know you better to see if you would qualify to participate in that particular trial. It's also important to let your own local healthcare team know that you're considering a clinical trial. They may want to, ideally they ought to, on both ends, talk to each other, the research team and the local team, about your health to make sure the study is safe for you and to coordinate your care while you're in a trial. I think that's very important. And what kind of goes on in a trial is explained here and in the next couple of slides. Well, first, the study staff, the principal investigator or the study coordinator would explain the trial in detail, gather more information about you as an individual. They would screen you again to determine if you qualify. If you've had all of your questions answered and you're a good candidate for the trial, you would sign what's called informed consent. So you know everything that's sort of known about the medication or the intervention that's being studied. Many trials then will have a baseline visit. And some trials will have randomization where one may be assigned to the actual treatment intervention or medication. And there also could be a placebo group or a control group. And just a word about that, and Audrea had mentioned that in her and her family's decision. There are in the field of intestinal rehabilitation many studies that show benefits even for patients who are randomized to placebo groups. And some of that is thought to be because one may be interacting with a multidisciplinary team or being seen more frequently or other things in your care being optimized. And many studies have the ability after a certain time point for all patients in a trial to either cross over or to go into the treatment group. So these are important questions to ask for each trial because they're all, of course, designed somewhat differently. You'll need follow-up visits. Oftentimes those are at the research site at regularly scheduled visits. During the pandemic, people have had to change their approach here a lot. There can be the ability for virtual visits, asking about that. At those visits, the research team generally collects information about the efficacy of the intervention and your safety and well-being, of course. So again, just some practical questions to ask as a patient, I think, before starting or considering a clinical trial. What's the purpose of the study? What are we really trying to find out here? What treatment or tests will I have? Will I have access to those tests or lab results so that I don't have to have local labs and central labs drawn? simultaneously or within close proximity to each other. Again, what is the percentage of randomization? Is it a 1-to-1 experimental and placebo, or 2-to-1 or so forth? What are the known from the earlier studies possible risks, side effects, and benefits of the treatment? And that's probably at the end of the day one of the most important questions, of course. How will I know if the treatment's working? What will we look for there? How long does the trial last? Where, again, will the study take place? Is there any component where I would need to be hospitalized, or can this be done outpatient in a research center? Is there assistance in getting me to and from study sites if I live far away, such as rideshare services or beyond that? How often do I need to be seen at the site? Again, can virtual visits be performed? Is there perhaps a closer trial site that's activated or will be activated? How will my day-to-day life potentially be impacted? Everything from diary recording to, are there any restrictions in terms of my diet or so forth? And then paramount, and this goes for every trial, what steps are in place to ensure my privacy? So with that, I thank you guys for your time. Thanks to our amazing patients. Thanks to Lisa and Audrea for their stories, and to our sponsors at the Oley Foundation.
Thank you, Dr. Venick and Audrea and Michelle. Really appreciate your sharing your time and your expertise. Reminder to our audience, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, Q&A function. Although I think that we've got, excuse me, probably all the questions we're able to get to today. There's some really good questions. First, Tanya asks, and Michelle, this is something that you kind of talked about, but Dr. Venick, I think that you could probably address this too, and Audrea. How do you get your providers to communicate with one another if your team is kind of a diverse and diffused, I'll say? Michelle, or
I'm going to let Audrea handle that, because most of my providers have been central to me. But when I need like a second opinion or a sounding board, then I call my two doctors that I still have contact with in Memphis, just to get their opinions and guidance on that. But most of my doctors are central to here. So I'm going to let you handle that.
And maybe Dr. Venick may have a better answer than me, but I will just tell you, it was very difficult in Dallas for me. And I would have to just, every time I went to see another doctor, I would have to explain everything all over again and say, well, this is what this doctor told me. Now, it was just, I was in a constant state of explaining things and telling them asking them to be in contact with the other doctor. And I don't think that it was the most efficient way at all for me, but it was what it was for 7 years. And so that's what I did. So I don't know, maybe Dr. Venick can share a little more on that.
Thanks, Audrea and Michelle. Yeah, I mean, I think this is so variable. I see it at my own center, where all patients, right, healthcare providers are as well. And I see it, in our care too. I think trying to understand how your own healthcare providers communicate, and with the electronic medical records, sometimes there's benefits in that, and it has the ability to be somewhat seamless. But sometimes it seems that teams are quite busy, and communication, if the care is at multiple centers, leaves a lot to be desired. Asking about email threads, my chart, those types of things, old school phone calls. But the communication really is quite important, especially when one gets to the clinical trials, sort of looking into those, because I think having your local team and the trial team communicate is really important. I would say that this is an area of medicine that needs to continue to improve, and will always probably, that statement will be true, but being your best advocate, as Michelle said, is can't be understated.
I will say one quick thing. One of the things, like for Medicare, I'm that special age where I have the Medicare. They have very strict guidelines for what supplies you can order and the amounts that you can order. And mine are always above what they allow. And in order to get the supplies I need, my physicians have to accurately, very accurately record, for example, my outputs, the amount I put out every day, every week, every whatever, and whether or not I have continued odor issues, which goes without saying. So if everything, I go with my list of things that they have to write down at that visit, that I see them every 3 months, to address the amount of output, the odor issues, the number of times a day I empty my bag, all of that, so that when it's Medicare will deny, and we apply to have it reconsidered, when they ask for those notes, it will be in there. So you have a better chance of getting what you need. But you have to go with your list. I have to do it every 3 months. It does not matter. I see the same person every 3 months and they just don't remember. So that's another thing that you can do.
Thanks. These are all good ideas, I think be helpful. Tiffany had a question. She asked about determining the right balance and when you push the envelope. And then she also asked, I'm going to start with the short question first. She asks if a trial has been FDA approved, is there much safety in that? What does it mean when a trial is FDA approved and is on clinicaltrials.gov?
Thanks, Lisa. I can try to take a stab at that. Yeah, I mean, the trials on clinicaltrials.gov will be, for the vast majority, FDA approved. I do think that there is safety advantages in that, and that that there's a whole mechanism in place with regulators and oftentimes pharma working together to ensure safety. You often will know where, what type of a trial this is. Is this an early phase 1 or 2 trial versus a more advanced phase 3? The trial right sort of potentially before a drug is approved. So those are very important questions, Tiffany, who posted, and important to ask and kind of know where you are in terms of like how far to push the envelope. I think that's very individual in terms of how one's doing, how far along you are in your journey. Have you been under multidisciplinary care? Have you done tried and true things that have worked for some patients over the last 4 decades? That may not even involve new medicines or new trials. So probably, and Audrea and Michelle could share, but probably very individual in terms of how far to push things.
Thanks, Dr. Venick. Did Michelle or Audrea, do you have anything quick to add to that? We're almost at the end of our hour.
Sure, I can add to that. I'd say early on in what happened to me, my body wasn't ready for any new treatments. And so we just basically went slowly, step by step by step by step. And now that I've, been in it for 13 years, my body was now in a stable place and in a place and I communicated very regularly with my doctors and his team. Now, when it was in a stable place, then we could try something new. But until that point, my body wasn't ready. And so we didn't push the envelope there. So I think you have to know where you are and be very accurate and honest with yourself about, okay, am I the most stable that I am or ever will be? Or are things still really rough? Am I having more bad days than good days? Or if I'm having more good days than bad days, then maybe that's the time to consider it.
Thanks, Audrey. Those are good points. Appreciate that. So we're at the end of our hour. Appreciate all of your contributions. This has been a great webinar. I'm really pleased with how much you were able to contribute and share with our audience. I wanted to, let's see, I think Rosalind has a couple slides with some resources that we have available. The Oley Foundation join a study page. I just wanted to mention that there's an article on that page about the importance of clinical trials and why they're important. And on the Join a Study page, you find a list of clinical trials that have been reviewed by our research team to make sure that they're appropriate to our community, and just gives a little bit more oversight on protection of privacy and things like that. The third site here is the clinicaltrials.gov, which, as Dr. Venick said, provides a comprehensive listing of clinical trials in the US and abroad. Not on this list, but will soon be on our website, is a survey from Dr. Marion Winkler. It's a home parenteral nutrition patient reported outcomes questionnaire. It's a good resource for both doctors and patients to try to help you establish what's a priority for you, and to get a conversation going between the clinician and the patient. And the other one that occurred to me is Lift Echo. It's a resource for those of you out in the community who may be managed by a single practitioner, or where you're the only TPN patient that practitioner has. It's a resource for the clinician so that they can learn more about what's new and clinical trials, and just a bounty of information. And you can find that out. You can learn more if you Google Lift Echo. So thank you again to Michelle and Audrea and Dr. Venick for the excellent presentations and extremely informative Q&A. We appreciate you sharing your experiences and expertise with us today. And thank you again to our sponsor, Vectiv Bio, for making this educational program possible. Thank you also to everyone who's joined us today for the webinar. We'll post a recording of the presentation on the Oley website, and it'll be there for you to watch whenever you choose. We hope to see everyone again at Oley 2022, our annual conference, which will be held virtually this year, August 16th through 18th. Thanks again for joining us.